Okay, so today we're going to be covering the next topic, which is visual perception. So basically, we're going to be looking at how our eyes work today, how we're able to see things. We're going to be looking at the different parts of the eye. And if we have a bit of time, we might look at some of the visual perception principles as well. So the first thing we need to do before we look at the eye and the different parts of the eye is to define what is visual perception. So when we look at the word visual perception, it's basically your ability to judge, to perceive, to make sense of any sight-related information that your eyes receive. So sight-related information is basically any images that your eyes receive. And obviously we can only see things in our environment if we are exposed to some kind of visible light. So if we're in a dark room, we won't be able to see anything because there's no visible light there to allow our eyes to be able to see that image. So that's what visual perception is basically about. It's about firstly being able to interpret and then make sense of everything that you see. Now, in order for us to be able to have proper visual perception, we need to have a range of bodily structures, okay? And these bodily structures are called the visual sensory system. And the visual sensory system is not just the eye itself, but it's also the brain, specifically our occipital lobe, which is at the back of our head. That's the part involved in vision. And it's also neural pathways that are involved in visual processing. So although the eye is the main sensory organ for receiving that visual stimuli, the brain obviously has a big role in terms of perceiving or making sense of that visual stimuli or those images. So when we're talking about visual perception, as we're going to look at later in this chapter as well, it's not just a biological process, it is a psychological process as well. And on top of that, it is a social process as well. Okay, so we're going to be looking and trying to understand how is the way that we make sense of things, how is that influenced by things like social factors, for example, where we live, for example, what we're used to seeing. How is it influenced by psychological processes, like, for example, our past experiences, for example, our mindsets. Okay, so this is basically what we talk about when we're talking about psychological and social factors. So in other words, it's not just a matter of what we see, but also how we see that particular thing. So we already talked about how light is important for us to see. So when we're talking about visual sensation and perception, you can think of the eye as being like a camera. So if you look at this first diagram here, just like the camera has a lens that allows you to focus into an image, the eye also has a lens, okay? Obviously, the better your camera lens, the better your actual image will be in terms of how sharp it's going to be, in terms of how focused it's going to be. Okay, if you've got a good camera lens, your image is going to turn out very clear, not blurry, not kind of like grainy, okay? It's going to turn out nice and clear. And there are other parts of the eye as well. I'm not going to talk about these right now. We are going to cover them in the next few slides, okay? But when you think about your eyes, think of your eyes as being very similar to a camera, okay? When you detect an external object in your environment and when it catches your attention, just like a camera kind of detects that object, your eye kind of detects that object as well, okay? Now, light enters your eye through a small hole called the pupil, and we all kind of probably know what the pupil is. The pupil is basically your, the kind of like the, how would you call it? It's kind of like the dot of your eye, okay? It's basically through which light comes in. So if you look at this second image here, you would notice that the black, the black kind of dot gets bigger or smaller depending on how much light is in a particular room. So let me just see if I can get this color thing. Okay, so yeah, when you've got obviously enough light, the pupil remains small. It doesn't have to enlarge or dilate or get bigger because there's enough light in the room. When there's not enough room, the eye has to put in extra effort to make sure that whatever little light there is able to come into the eye and we are able to see as best as we can. For that reason, the pupil actually has to do some work and it has to get bigger, okay? And that the specific word we look for is dilate. So when we're in a room and it's not really that bright or it's kind of getting a little bit dim, or even if you're outside during like Maghrib time and, you know, there's not a lot of light outside, your pupils are going to be dilating and getting bigger as compared to when there is proper light or a proper amount of brightness outside. Now, obviously, light enters your eye through the pupil. And when the light enters your eye through the pupil, the next step or the next place it goes to is the retina. Okay, the retina, we are going to talk about the retina a little bit more in the next slide, but the retina is like a camera film. Okay, it kind of temporarily stores that image, okay, before it goes to the brain for processing. Now, what we are focused on though for the next part of this particular slide is the iris. So the iris is the colored ring of our eye, okay? So if you say, okay, I've got brown eyes, that means the color of your iris is brown. If you've got blue eyes, then that means the color of your iris is blue. It's basically the colored ring of our eye. But rather than just giving our eye its actual physical appearance, the iris is also important because the muscles of the iris actually control how much light enters the eye. So if light enters your eye through the pupil, which we just looked at, the iris actually controls how much light is actually coming in, okay? And obviously when, similar to before, when there's enough light and we don't need as much light coming in and, it's nice and bright outside, the iris actually closes, and that means that the pupil doesn't have to dilate too much. And when there's not enough light coming in or it's a little bit dim, the iris actually opens up, which also opens up the possibility for the pupil to get bigger as well. Okay, so the iris and the pupil work together, and obviously what the iris does or how much the iris opens up as a muscle or how much it closes will also determine how big or how small the pupil is going to become. Okay, so now we're just going to, hopefully that kind of makes sense so far. So now we're just going to move on to the role of the lens and the ciliary muscles. So like we said before, each of your eyes has a lens, and that lens basically allows us to achieve a nice clear image, okay? If you've got a camera and your lens is a little bit dirty, or let's say you've got an older phone and your camera doesn't have a really powerful lens, when you take a photo, yeah, you're taking a photo, but it's really grainy. So if you like zoom in, you can see the little pixels, or, it's not like really sharp. It's kind of similar to the eye, okay? The lens of the eye is also similar to the lens of a phone or of a camera or, your camera on your phone, because it actually allows you to achieve fine detail in images through focusing, okay? Every time the lens focuses, we are able to achieve clear images. So obviously, when we're talking about how much the lens actually focuses or how much the lens actually expands or constricts, we are going to again talk about a type of muscle that helps to achieve this. Now, for the pupil, this muscle was the iris, but for the lens, this muscle is called the ciliary muscle. Okay, the ciliary muscles are basically the part of the eye that control the focusing of the lens automatically. So if I am let's say if you're reading a book and you bring that book very close to your eye or very close to your field of vision, the words are going to be really close to your eye. And so you're going to have to like focus on them a little bit more to make sure you can see them clearer, okay? Because they're so close to your eye. It's not a comfortable distance. If you move the book very far away from your eye and put it at about, 0.5 meter or 1 meter length away from you, your eyes are going to have to focus again because now the book and the words are quite far from you. Okay, so obviously depending on how far an object is from your field of vision or from your eyes, your lens is going to have to do its work in order to focus on that image accordingly, okay, to make sure you can have the best vision and visual perception of that image. Now, obviously your ciliary muscles have a big role to play in determining how much or how little your lens is going to focus. And that idea of us focusing our lens according to the image or according to the distance of the image that we're looking at. So obviously putting a little bit more effort when someone brings words very close to your eye, also putting in a lot of effort when, someone's taken a book and moved it very far from your field of vision. That is called accommodation. Okay, accommodation is the automatic process of our ciliary muscles and our lens adjusting in order to allow us to see what we're seeing in the most comfortable way without straining our eyes too much. So this is one of the reasons why parents often tell kids don't go to the TV and watch so close to the TV, because it's not good to be reading things or to be seeing things very close to your eye. You need to have some kind of a comfortable distance there. So obviously when we're talking about the image, I mentioned before that before going to the brain, your image that you see is actually formed on something called the retina. And we're going to learn about the retina in the next slide. And obviously it's then transmitted to the brain by a special nerve called the optic nerve, okay? And the final destination where the image is going to be perceived or judged or made sense of will be the brain. So finally, we're coming now to the retina. So the retina is basically a very thin layer of, we say, photosensitive tissue or light sensitive nerve tissue. Okay, and this basically is at the back of the eye. So the retina is at the back of the eye. It's a very thin lining. And what it does is that it actually focuses images. So when an image falls on your eye, we actually say that that image is falling on the retina. And the retina, what it does is that it converts those images or that image related information, that visual information, to electrical impulses. And if you remember yesterday, the day before, when we were learning about the different processes involved, the process relating to converting raw data to a form that the brain can use is actually called transduction. Okay, so the retina does have a role to play in transduction. So obviously before the image is sent to the brain, the retina is the one that kind of holds that image temporarily, okay? The retina is important because it has a layer of photoreceptors, and photoreceptors are light-sensitive cells, okay? Light-sensitive and color-sensitive cells. And we've got two types of photoreceptors. So we've got cones. These are the ones here. This is a very simple diagram, by the way. And we've got rods, okay? Now, cones are important because they help us to detect color. And how you can remember that is that cones start with the letter CO and color starts with the letter CO. And rods obviously help us to detect brightness. Okay, so if I'm in a dark room, or if I'm in a room where the lighting is not too good, the rods are the ones that are going to allow me to detect any brightness from the image that has been cast onto the retina. And the cones are what's going to allow me to see my world in color, essentially. Okay, and we are going to learn a little bit more about specifically what rods and cones do in the next slide. So just for the retina, remember that the image that you see falls onto the retina. The retina will detect the brightness and color using the rods and cones from that image, and then that image will be converted into an electrical impulse and sent to the brain. Alrighty, oops, I'm just going to clear those. All right, so we'll have a look now at some more details about what the cones and rods do. So like I said before, the cone is a light-sensitive cell. It's a photoreceptor, which is at the back of the eye, which is in the retina. And this is what allows us to have color vision. So if we didn't have cones in our retina, we would not be able to interpret or look at images in color. Okay, we would only see black and white. And so it's important for you to remember that cones do play an important role in color vision. Okay, and without them, we may not be able to see color in the same way that we do. Now, there are 6 million cones in each eye. So that's important for you to remember. 6 million cones in each eye, because sometimes we might assess this in multiple choice questions. Now, in order for us to see all the colors that we see, there are 3 specific types of cones in 3 colors, okay? The first one is red, the second one is green, and the last one is blue. And so these are the main 3 cones that actually allow us to see all the full visual spectrum of color that we are able to visually see in our environment. Now, cones are not just important for color, but they're also important for visual acuity. Visual acuity is just a fancy way of saying the sharpness of images. So how clear an image is, how not blurry it is determined by cones. Now, cones are most important for us in daytime vision, because if you ever walked out in the middle of the night, you'll notice that you can't really see colors in your environment when your environment is dark or not well lit. Okay, but obviously in the daytime when we go out, it's such a beautiful day, you can see all the colors of the trees and the road and the sun and I don't know, everything. Okay, so cones are more important for us for daytime vision. compared to nighttime vision. So just remember the memory tip, CO for cones, CO for the fact that they help us to detect color in our images and in our world. Okay, so just don't forget that. Okay, now we're just going to try to understand what rods do. So rods are again a type of photoreceptor or a light sensitive cell in the retina. They're located at the back, as I showed you before, and they allow us the ability to see objects in terms of brightness. So they're really important for us in night vision. So obviously, if you go outside in the middle of the night, it's not really well lit outside. It's not very bright. So whatever light there is, maybe from a street lamp, from some cars on the road, you know, you can kind of make sense of what's around you using your rods. Okay, your rods take advantage of what little light there is and help you to make sense of your world. So you don't like walk onto the road or trip over something. You are able to see in the best way possible, even in low light conditions. Now, there are a lot more rods in your eye or in your retina than there are cones. In fact, we have 120 million rods. So remember, 6 million cones and 120 million rods. Just something we might put in multiple choice at some point. We wouldn't ever assess this in any other way. Okay, so obviously rods are more sensitive to light. Remember, rods, the main thing that rods are concerned with is light and brightness. Cones are more concerned with color. So obviously, like I said, rods will take advantage of any little amount of light there is to help you to see. Now, rods are sensitive to motion, but not to color. This means that if we see a moving object, our rods are going to be more likely to be active when viewing a moving object as compared to our cones. And as I gave this comparison before, rods are not really useful for sharpness of images, but they are very useful for night vision when there is very low levels of light or low levels of brightness in the environment. Okay, so those are our rods. So rods and cones are just two types of photoreceptors that are found in the retina, and they help us to make sense of our images by giving us the ability to see color and by giving us the ability to pick up those small amounts of light in otherwise dark places or dark environments. And remember, without rods and cones, your ability to visually perceive your world would not be the same as it is now. Okay, so just looking at the parts of the eye now, some of these we've already covered, some of these we haven't covered. Honestly, as long as you really understand what's on this slide, this is similar to the one in your book. This is kind of what we really need to know. So you need to obviously be able to label the eye, because that is one of our VCAR kind of key knowledge for this. And you need to be able to explain or, you know, just describe briefly what is the function of each of these. So the cornea is a clear layer. It's just basically the initial layer above your eye, above your eyeball, okay? That just lies above that eyeball there. When people get sick and their eyes get like infected, it's usually the cornea that gets affected, okay? And so the cornea and the conjunctiva are the two things that get affected there. The cornea doesn't have much of a role to play in terms of the functioning of the eye as much as the other components. But what the cornea does is that it protects your eye from things like dust coming in, from things like foreign substances and that kind of stuff. It's just like a thin protective layer. And the pupil, so the pupil is, like we said, it's the hole or the little dot in the center of your iris. And when it's dark, the pupil will open up. When it's light, then the pupil, you know, will be constricted. We've got the aqueous humor. So remember, we've got two things here, the aqueous humor and the vitreous humor. The aqueous humor is the water-based liquid, okay? Aqueous coming from the word aqua, which means water. So just remember it like that. It's the watery liquid that actually fills the space between your cornea and your lens. And what it does is that it actually helps to kind of preserve the shape of your eye, okay? Because obviously when you've got issues with the shape of your eye, that's when we have a lot of these eye issues coming up, like certain eye disorders and eye health related conditions. The vitreous humor, on the other hand, is a jelly-like substance. It also has the similar function in the sense that it helps to maintain the shape of the eye. But the place where a lot of students lose marks is they forget which one is the jelly-like substance, which one is the watery liquid. So remember aqueous humor? Remember, aqueous sounds like aqua, aqua is water. So aqueous humor is the watery liquid one. The iris is just in front of your lens. So like we said before, the iris is the colored ring of your eye. If you've got green eyes, your iris is going to be color green. And the iris obviously contains a muscle which changes, and every time it changes, it actually allows the pupil to dilate more or to dilate less. Ciliary muscles obviously are the muscles that influence how the lens changes or how the lens brings images into focus. The actual lens is the actual mechanism by which you are able to focus on images, okay? Just like a camera lens would focus on an image, your lens in your eye helps you to focus images onto the retina, which is the back surface of the eye, in other words. The optic nerve is basically the nerve that allows, it's the nerve or the pathway that allows that visual information after it's been converted by the retina into a neural impulse to go directly to the brain. So that's the optic nerve. The blind spot, you don't really need to know as much, but the blind spot is just a little spot at the back of your eye where there are no photoreceptors. And so this particular part of your eye might not be able to perceive the rest of the image in the same way that the retina does. The yellow spot or the fovea is basically the section of the retina. It contains a very large number of color sensitive cells or cones. And so it really helps us when we're looking at an object from the front. So if you show me like a really nice painting that's full of color and you show it to me directly in my field of vision, right in front of me, my cones in my fovea are going to be able to make sense of all the colors in that particular thing, as compared to if you were putting it to the side and telling me to look at it from my side eye or something like that. So it's always better when you put it right in front. The retina, like I said, is just a thin layer at the back of your eye containing your rods and your cones or your photoreceptors. And the choroid is basically a black layer that forms the inside lining. But you don't really need to know what the choroid is, I suppose, as much as the rest. So we'll just probably cross that out for now. Yeah, okay, so that's what the parts of the eye are. You've also got another diagram in your book that you can have a look at if this one doesn't make too much sense. But I think this is pretty straightforward. Alrighty. So when we're looking at sensation and perception of visual information, this is basically everything we've just covered. It's just a diagram taken from your book. So we've got these processes mentioned here again. So I'm just going to give them a quick highlight. So this is obviously the actual stimuli, which is the light energy or the light information. Reception happens first when we receive the visual or image related information. Transduction then happens when the light is converted from electromagnetic energy to neural impulses. And this usually happens in the retina just before it goes to the brain. Transmission is when this neural impulse now, which used to be the light-related electromagnetic information, is then sent via the optic nerve to the brain. And in the brain, it's going to be received in the primary visual cortex, which we know is in our occipital lobe in this area here. And the occipital lobe and the primary visual cortex are basically going to help us to make sense of that information and use whatever other information from past experiences, from what we've seen in our lives, to make sense of what that particular image or thing is. Okay, so that's basically a very straightforward process, and this is the same diagram from your book as well. Okay, this is again just taken from your book, exactly the same thing from the previous slide, but just a little bit more, just a few more images here. So I'm not going to go through this in depth, but you can read through it. It's just there. Again, this is a really confusing diagram, and every year the students always panic a bit when they see this one. Now, this is not actually a diagram you need to know as per VCA key skills. So honestly, don't stress too much about it. It's just showing you that if you look at something in your left visual field, it's going to show up in your right hemisphere or your right primary visual cortex. If you look at something in your right visual field, it's going to show up in your left primary visual cortex. So the contralateral nature of processing. In fact, we've already kind of understood or learnt this concept when we did split brain surgery. Okay, so if the word egg is placed on the right-hand side of the screen, it ends up in the guy's left hemisphere. Okay, so you guys understand this process anyway, so don't stress too much about that diagram there. Alrighty. Right, so this is just a quick summary of how it all works together, how all these processes kind of work together. I'm not going to go through this in too much depth because, again, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, just go through these processes. It's basically everything that we've looked at, from looking at the dilation of the pupil, to looking at, you know, the rods and the cones and what role they have, to looking at how the information is then processed when it reaches the brain. Okay, so that's just, if you still have some issues or concerns about this slide or understanding how it works, just send me an email and I'll explain any of those steps a little bit more. Okay, now in the next period in the offline, we are in the next, no, we're not in the next, it's 9 o'clock, yeah. Okay, in the next period in the offline session from 9:50, you're going to watch these 3 videos. These are 3 really nice videos that you can watch. They're not really that long, but they will definitely help you to better understand visual perception, okay? So please have a watch of them. They will be really beneficial for you.